welcome back. Tonight we're going into the dark side of the Olympians, the versions you heard when you were small, the ones with the clean endings, the ones where the light always finds a way through, and the hero comes out changed but intact. No, going into the version that lives under that one. The version where you stop midway through and you think, wait, what kind of beings were these actually? What did they do when no one was watching? What did they want underneath the wanting? What frightened them? Why, for thousands of years, across cultures that had nothing in common except the dark, why did human beings get on their knees? Let that question find a place in your chest. Just let it sit. Find the answer together, somewhere between now and wherever sleep decides to take you. Before these gods existed the way we know them, before the mountain had its 12 thrones, before the hierarchy made any sense, before the world had anything resembling order at all, there was this, a sky that kept its children in the earth, a father named Uranus, the sky itself, the first of the first generation of things that had names. And he was afraid, looked at what Gaia produced, and he had felt it, that cold, specific terror of being outrun. The Titans were one thing, but the Cyclopes, Caton shares, 100 hands each. Strength so far past comprehension that Uranus couldn't look at them without feeling something in him buckle. So he did what frightened things do, hid them, pushed them back inside Gaia's body, back into the dark, back into the Earth's interior. He sealed the exit, Gaia, and I find this part hard to describe exactly. It isn't quite screaming, it isn't grief in any way that word maps neatly. Gaia experienced something that moved through stone and root and underground water, and eventually she reached toward the Titans, still walking free, and she asked, Who? Who will do what needs to be done? Who will cut the fear out of my body? You understand, Uranus, the thing. Every powerful thing that has ever existed has felt that specific cold current, the sense that something is approaching that will make you obsolete. Empires feel it, parents feel it, sometimes, and hate themselves for it. Institutions feel it and call it something else. The fear of being replaced is so old, it predates any word for it. It was in the first muscle that ever contracted in self-defense. Uranus wasn't monstrous in any complicated way. He was just afraid. A rule, and hold this, because everything downstream depends on it. The rule in the universe of the Olympians is, power is not taken, power is inherited through violence, and every generation has to commit the act. Every throne then carries the stain of the act that made it a throne. Every crown comes with a debt someone else paid. Well, the law doesn't bend. Tonight, when you find yourself thinking, surely this one will break the pattern, when you feel that pull, that hope, that's exactly when you'll understand what it cost for the law to be real. One who answered was Cronus, youngest of the Titans, the last. Sat, and he listened while the others looked at what Gaia had shaped. A sickle made from her own body, her own grief made into iron, and looked away. Cronus took it, dark that had no moon, because there was no moon. Yet, in the original darkness of a world barely underway, he found his father. He used the sickle. He did what Gaia had asked, separated sky from earth. Literally, cosmically. In a way the Greeks understood as the first real wound of the universe, the wound that made everything else possible. And he threw what he'd put into the sea. Cronus became king. From the sea foam, from the churning white water gathering around what Cronus had discarded, something rose, 'cause nothing in this universe is simply discarded. Nothing thrown away stays thrown. Aphrodite rose from that foam, goddess of desire, of beauty that undoes thought, of love that arrives without asking, born from castration and salt water and a son who did not look back. That's the origin. Not warmth, not tenderness, violence and the cold indifference of someone who had already moved on to the next problem. Sit with that. Let it find somewhere to settle. It matters. Everything that comes after carries this origin, the way a stone carries the pressure that formed it. Cronus ruled for a time, and this is the strange aching truth that the myths don't quite know what to do with. For a time the world was good. The Golden Age is what they called it. Titans governed with something like ease, something like abundance. Humans in the old stories lived without war, without the particular grinding grief that outlasts the moment that caused it. The world exhaled. Cronus was not the dark devouring figure you might be assembling in your mind. He was a king who had done what kings do to become kings. For a while, that seemed like it might be enough. I need to pause here. The Golden Age is one of those things that keeps slipping when I try to hold it. I don't know why I keep returning to it. Maybe because it costs something to admit that the monster had a golden age, that the thing that comes later was not always the thing. Warning came, as warnings always do, from something older than thrones. Gaia spoke. The fates opened their mouths. Came out was simple. A child of yours will do to you what you did to your father. There it is, the loop, closing him before it opened. Cronus heard it, and something rearranged inside him, who held the sickle. He knew exactly what a child was capable of. He had done it himself at the youngest age, so with a logic that is simple and brutal and completely understandable to anyone who has ever tried to stop time from moving. He swallowed his children, one by one born, each tiny Olympian drawing the first breath of the world. And Cronus was there, swallowing, sealing, containing Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, 5 gods, 5 times. Wife Rhea watched. Let that expand a little. Rhea watched 5 children disappear into her husband's body, one after another, and she understood something Cronus didn't. There is a kind of patience that looks like stillness from the outside, but is something else entirely from the inside. Accumulation, geology, pushed down far enough stops being grief and starts being pressure, and pressure eventually becomes force. The woman saying nothing is not the woman feeling nothing. Rhea was waiting, was building. She was becoming something the situation didn't have a name for yet. When the 6th child came, when Zeus was ready to enter the world, She did not hand him over. She wrapped the stone in cloth. She handed it to Cronus. She watched. This is the part I keep coming back to, and I'm not entirely sure why it stays with me. She watched the king of the Titans, the most powerful being alive, swallow a rock and not notice. Not notice it wasn't a child. Not notice the weight was wrong, the sound was wrong, the absence of any small living warmth. He swallowed a stone and called it enough. She took Zeus to Crete, cave, earth as cradle. The Carettes clashing their shields outside so a baby's crying couldn't carry to the father's ears. The first real deception in the Olympian story is a mother hiding a child in a cave. Already, can you feel it somewhere in the chest? Already you see that these gods were not born into power. They were smuggled into the future, hidden in rock and darkness, was said. Nursed, while above them the world turned, and their father held a stone inside himself and thought it was over. Zeus grew. The myths move through this quickly. Growth isn't mythological. Growth is biological, ordinary, the thing that happens to everything that doesn't get stopped. But stay with it a moment. What does it mean to grow, knowing what you know? To be the hidden child who was not supposed to exist. Understand? From whatever moment, a god becomes capable of understanding anything, that somewhere above you, a father has swallowed your siblings, has pressed them into the absolute dark of himself, decided that the future does not have the right to arrive. What does that make you? Anyway, when Zeus was grown, Rhea gave Cronus a drink. Not what it appeared, moved through the king of the Titans, and loosened what he'd sealed shut. And up they came, one by one. In the order swallowed, the Olympians emerged, alive, whole, fully formed, having spent their early divine existence inside their father's body, in absolute dark, in absolute silence, in captivity so intimate it barely has a name. Hestia first, then Demeter, then Hades, then Poseidon. 5 gods born twice, once from their mother, into the brief cold moment before their father's hands closed, and once from their father into the light of a world about to be remade. The war that followed lasted 10 years. 10 years. I don't know how to make that feel like what it was. Not a number, a fact about time that you have to just receive and let sit there. So, there, 10 years, not a metaphor, not a poetic compression of something that felt like 10 years. 10 actual years of Titan against Olympian, old power, trying to hold its shape against new power, still figuring out what shape it wanted. The sky shaking with things that had no word in any mortal language and probably shouldn't have. And Zeus did something Cronus hadn't done. He went down, descended into Tartarus, the deepest dark beneath everything. The place where Cronus had thrown the hecaton shares and the cyclopes, after inheriting his father's terror of them, broke. Zeus broke their chains. Mighty offered freedom in exchange for alliance, ransomed him. The cyclopes with the thunderbolt, lightning distilled into something a hand could hold. Concentrated storm, violence made personal. And the hecaton shares with 100 arms and the capacity to move the world itself, to throw mountains the way you'd throw a stone across water. the difference between Zeus's victory and Cronus's. Cronus raised the sickle alone. Zeus built a coalition. This matters for everything that comes after. Because the Olympian order, the world as it exists once the war ends, once the Titans are sealed in Tartarus, and the new gods divide what's left in a lottery, the Olympian order is an alliance. 12 thrones on a mountain, 12 powers in permanent negotiation, 12 personality overlapping and conflicting and desiring and envying and loving and hating across the whole length of human history. A family. Families carry darkness the way a foundation carries weight. It is structural. It is load-bearing. Pull it out, and everything above it falls. So, let us go into the mountain, through the room where the gods sit. Just look at them the way the worshippers couldn't. Not from below, not with desperate hands and the particular posture of someone who needs something badly enough to kneel. At eye level, or where you'd look anyone with enormous power. And there's specific freedom from consequence that enormous power provides. What? Let us ask the question the temples were built in part to discourage. Who are these, actually? What do they want? What do they do when they want it? What does it mean that for 3,000–4,000 years, longer maybe, human beings looked at these specific beings and called them divine? Begin with Zeus. Everything begins with Zeus. Sits at the center of the Olympian system, the way. And I'm going to try this comparison and I'm not sure it lands. It's like saying a planet is a mood. The scale is wrong. The way gravity sits at center of an orbit. He is the organizing principle. Everything else bends toward or away from the specific force of him. Everything else gets defined in relation to where he stands. Zeus is king. Zeus is the sky. Zeus is the thunderbolt and the eagle and the oak tree and the order of the world as reconstructed after 10 years of war. Greek religious imagination. He comes closest to what the supreme being looks like inside a system that officially has no single supreme being. The one the other Olympians appeal to. The one decisions are final. The one before whom even gods sometimes have to look away. Now look more closely. Look at what he actually does. The myths are specific about this, detailed, and they did not encode these details by accident. The list of Zeus's violations is enormous. It is central. Scholars have catalogued it for centuries, filling commentaries, filling reference texts with names and circumstances, and the particular forms Zeus chose for each encounter. And even those catalogues, probably incomplete. Zeus sees what he wants. He takes it. Disguise, with transformation, with coercion, wearing the mask of transformation. A bull, a swan, a shower of gold, an eagle, a flame, the approximate shape of a husband, the voice of something, trusted, leader, Ganymede, Europa, who placed flowers on the horns of a bull, so gentle she thought it was safe, and was wrong, and was carried across the sea on its back, or turned into a white cow to hide her from Hera's attention, then tormented across the world for years, while the one who had destroyed her life watched from above. Ys swallowed, like his father swallowed, a goddess entire, swallowed alive, because an oracle told Zeus her child would surpass him. And so he did the only thing the Olympian inheritance actually is. He internalized the threat. He made it part of his own body and called that safety. The myths call these affairs. They are careful about what they call them. Want to say more about that carefulness, but I keep losing the thread of it. It's the kind of thing that's easier to feel than to say. To say, the aestheticization of it, the way violence becomes myth, becomes art, becomes a painting in a museum that people stand in front of and say beautiful. I kept this in because I didn't know how to cut it cleanly. Jaw tightens perhaps. Let it. Because this is the dark thing at the center of the king of the gods. The thing the mythology encodes, even as it turns it into beauty, even as it becomes the famous paintings and the sculptures and stories told to children as adventure. Zeus's power and Zeus's appetite share the same territory, governed by the same rules, which bend toward whatever he wants on a given day. The sky is his. The bodies beneath the sky exist within his jurisdiction. The only variable is which disguise the moment calls for. I need to pause here. What comes next is the part the myths get complicated about, and I want to be honest that I find it complicated too. And yet, Zeus is also genuinely the god of order, of justice, of xenia, the sacred law of hospitality, the principle that a stranger at your door carries a divine claim on your protection, that to harm a guest is to harm something cosmic. He watches oaths, the one the powerless call on when every other appeal has closed. The lightning bolt thrown in rage is the same lightning bolt thrown at tyrants. God who violates and the God who protects are not two separate beings taking shifts on the same throne. They are one thing at one moment, simultaneously, what the myths understood. And I think this is what made them last. This specific, uncomfortable knowledge that power is not separable from its abuses. Capacity to protect and the capacity to destroy are the same capacity, aimed differently. The king who keeps order is the king who defines what order means, and the definition bends always toward the king. Let that sit. The weight of it is real weight. Anyway, why move your attention sideways now? Let it drift to the goddess beside him, his wife, his sister, Hera. Hera, queen of the gods, goddess of marriage, guardian of the bond between husband and wife, married to Zeus. The goddess of marriage is married to the most compulsively unfaithful being in the cosmos. Protector of the marital bond, lives inside a marriage that is an unending catalogue of betrayals, each one transformed into myth, each one producing a hero or a monster or a creature wandering the world carrying the evidence of what the king of the gods wanted on some particular afternoon. Hera is furious. She is always furious. Homer establishes this early, and the tradition never revises it. Jealous, vindictive, relentless, pursuing the children and lovers of her husband with a methodical ferocity. The myths usually frame as proportionate, excessive. The character flaw of the goddess, the problem with Hera. Wait, sit with this. thing the myths encode, maybe without fully meaning to. The way the deepest things sometimes slip past the part of a story that knows it's being told is that Hera's anger is completely logical. More precise, is the exact emotional response to an impossible position, to be the goddess of the institution being violated against you every single day by the most powerful being in existence, within whose thumb you have no real recourse, from whose court you cannot leave, and to be told by the culture, by the stories, by the very existence of myths that record your husband's conquests as adventures, your responses as hysteria, that you are the one with the problem, persecutes Heracles. The myths present this as monstrous of her. Heracles is a hero. Heracles is magnificent. He is also. And this is the thing Hera has to look at every time she looks at him. The walking proof of what Zeus did. Embodiment. The living evidence. The child that exists because her husband took what he wanted, and she is expected to absorb that and move on and act with grace. She sends the gadfly to torment Io. She arranges the destruction of Semele. She does genuinely terrible things to people who did not deserve them, and this is true, and it does not cancel the other truth. And the myths hold both truths in the same hands because they were by people who understood, at some level, that none of this is about gods. Hera never leaves. This is the detail. She returns to Zeus, fights, she withdraws, she is. And I find this one hard to get past. I don't know why this one more than the others. She is hung in the sky by her wrists, golden chains, her own husband, punishment for rebellion, and the other gods pass beneath her and do not intervene. And then she comes back. She is the goddess of marriage. She will not violate that even to save herself from it. What do you do with that? What does it mean to be the guardian of something that is eating you alive? The question doesn't open into an answer. Some questions aren't built that way. Built to be felt. To sit in the chest next to the other things you carry and not resolve. Let this one find its place there. Let sleep, when it comes, come around it. Why? Move from the throne room to the boundary now, the edge of things, where the sky meets the sea, where Poseidon, and he isn't sitting. Actually, I keep writing that he sits, and it's wrong. He is always moving, the way the sea moves, the way that moves when the sea decides it has an opinion about the land. Poseidon is the god of the sea, of earthquakes, of horses. The combination seems strange until it doesn't. Greek imagination. These three things share a quality, without announcement, of reshaping the landscape before you've had time to brace for it. The sea that takes ships, grabbed, the ground that opens under a city mid-sentence, the horse that bolts for no reason you can see from where you're standing. Poseidon is all of this at once, and he carries it the way his brother carries the thunderbolt, as an extension of personality, as the long arm of how he feels on a given day. Personality is enormous in a way I find genuinely hard to describe. Is large the way the sea is large, capable of a sudden change of mood that no instrument measures in advance, that the weather gives no warning of. When Athens chose Athena's olive tree over the salt spring he'd struck from the rock of the Acropolis. And I want to linger here because the salt spring matters. He made something from nothing. He struck stone and gave the city water. And they said, "No thank you." He flooded the Attic plain. He flooded it. He expressed disappointment in physical geography when Minos of Crete failed to sacrifice the white bull. Poseidon had sent as a test, kept it because it was too beautiful. Poseidon arranged for Minos's wife, Pasiphae, to fall in love with the bull. Came of that the Minotaur, the labyrinth, a generation of horror built from a single unkept promise, and Poseidon watching from the water, patient, because the sea has all the time there is. The god does not forget. Odysseus can confirm this. 10 years trying to get home. Every time the ships found open water, every time the wind seemed cooperative, every time a coastline appeared that might finally be Ithaca, the sea would remember. The sea would move. Crime. He blinded the Cyclops Polyphemus, son of Poseidon. He blinded him to survive, which is what you do when a being has already eaten 6 of your men and is planning to continue. Logical, necessary, the only available option. For this, for the act of staying alive, Odysseus spent 10 years in Poseidon's memory. The punishment wasn't proportionate to the crime, it was proportionate to the feeling. The gods' feelings don't observe a ceiling. They don't have a time limit. They are governed by attachment, by what is theirs, what they consider part of themselves, and a violation of that, however necessary, meets the full weight of what a god can sustain indefinitely. With the dark truth of Poseidon, the god controlling the medium through which people must travel to reach each other, to trade, to flee, to find their way, uses that control as an expression of how he feels. Why, the sea, which is indifferent the way this is always ultimately indifferent, becomes in the mythological imagination a personality, a grudge wearing water as a costume, memory that the ocean keeps. Below all of this, below the sea, and below the earth, and below the reach of the sun, which even now, even as you lie in your dark, is on the other side of the world, doing what suns do. Below all of this is the other brother, Hades. He received the underworld in the lottery. He did not choose it. 3 brothers, 3 domains, 3 lot drawn from a helmet, and Hades drew the third, and the third was everything beneath, every shadow, every person who has ever stopped being a person, every spirit that descends from the world above into the permanence below, drew the underworld, and he went down into it, and he has been there ever since, on his ebony throne beside his queen, governing the one kingdom that grows without pause, the one domain that never loses a citizen, because everything that lives eventually becomes his. Hades is the administrator of necessity. He is the god of the place every living thing eventually inhabits. Judges sought the dead by what they actually were, the extraordinary to the Elysian fields, the ordinary to the asphodel meadows, the genuinely transgressive to Tartarus. Is more than can be said for several of the gods above him. Pause here and say something honestly. The darkness around Hades, the visual vocabulary of it, the helmet, the shadows, the association with death, has made him easy to read as a villain. What? He isn't. Be clear about that before the next part, because the next part is the one story where Hades becomes something other than an administrator, and I don't want you reading it through the wrong lens. Persephone was picking flowers in a meadow. That detail. I've tried to think about why it stays with me the way it does, and I don't have a clean answer. I just know it does. Specificity of it, the ordinariness. A girl picking flowers, Narcissus in some versions, and then the earth opened and Hades came up and she went down. The myths disagree about what she felt. It's unusual. The myths are generally comfortable with certainty, with a clean line of event and cause. With Persephone, they hesitate. Some versions say she was taken entirely against her will, and Demeter's grief. Demeter, who refused to let the world grow, who locked the seasons, who starved the earth until Zeus had to negotiate. Grief is the measure. But other versions carry something more complicated. A girl who was, in some reading of the silences between the words, not entirely unwilling to leave the meadow. Queen who, once below, became something unavailable to her in the world above. Not her mother's daughter, not the flower picker, not the expected and the domestic, and the already decided, but the ruler of the place all things go. A goddess with a throne and a gravity the Olympians above cannot replicate, because they are still entangled with the noise of the living. She ate the pomegranate seeds. 6 in some versions, 3 in others. 1. The number varies. The act doesn't. She ate something from the land of the dead, and by the law Hades governs. Anyone who eats in the land of the dead belongs to it. She stays for part of every year. The world above calls that part spring. She goes back down. The world above calls her absence winter. This is the myth's explanation for seasons, which is the official version, the surface, the question. Underneath it is the question that the ancient hesitation in the source material keeps open. Did she choose? And if she chose, what does it mean that she chose this? She didn't. What does it mean that the myths need to ask? Your breath slows. Let it anyway. Now a different kind of darkness, brightness actually, that functions as darkness by being too much Apollo, god of the sun, of music, of poetry, of prophecy, of medicine, of reason, of the examined life. Archer whose arrows are also light. The musician whose lyre imposes order. The god of Delphi, where the oracle breathes the earth's pneuma through a sacred fissure and speaks in words that require interpretation, that are precisely as clear as Apollo intends them to be, who is never entirely, which is always enough to be technically true, which is the particular honesty of a god, who is also the god of what honesty costs. Steady, know yourself, says the inscription on his temple. Nothing in excess. Apollo destroys people with a consistency that compares a pattern once you notice it, which I find, and I'm aware this is an odd thing to admit in the middle of a description, I find genuinely exciting in a way the other Olympians don't quite replicate. Something about the elegance of it, the variety of method drawn to beauty and skill, the way the sun moves across the sky, without preference, without malice, simply an expression of what he is, which means everything he touches either grows or burns, depending on the distance and the day. Hyacinthus, Spartan prince, full enough that both Apollo and the west wind Zephyrus wanted him, which is already a dangerous position to be in, wanting being what it is among the divine. Apollo threw the discus, Zephyrus, in jealousy, blew the discus off its arc. The discus struck Hyacinthus in the head. The blood on the grass became the flower that carries his name. Apollo stood over the boy he had loved and felt. And this is the part I kept coming back to while writing this, the part that resists summary. He felt the grief specific to a being that cannot die, which is not simple grief, which is grief that cannot end the way grief ends for mortals, cannot arrive at the reunion or the acceptance that comes with knowing you will follow. It is permanent. It is a wound in a body that will never close, because the body will never stop existing to carry it. Cassandra, princess of Troy. Apollo gave her prophecy, the actual sight of what was coming. And then, when she refused him, or so the version most people know goes, though the older sources are as ambiguous here as they are about Persephone, and I kept that ambiguity in, because cutting it felt dishonest. He adjusted the gift. He left the sight intact. He sealed her voice, would see true, always, perfectly, and no one who heard her would believe a word of it. The words would land in ears that were somehow closed to them from the inside out. She watched the wooden horse being dragged through the gates of Troy. She said, "There are men inside." She said it clearly, what she saw, which was, sees, the end of everything. The end of her city and her family and the world she had grown up inside. Why? And the Trojans celebrated around her and pulled the horse through the gates. And I keep returning to this because I don't think I've found the right way to say it yet. I'm not sure it can be said in a way that lands correctly. There is a cruelty in that arrangement, but specific it feels designed. To give someone perfect sight and make them indistinguishable from someone who sees nothing. Make truth and madness wear the same face in the mouths of those who most needed to hear the difference. That is what Apollo did. With a rejection, the god of reason, the god of self-knowledge, God who put those words on the stone of his own temple and then built a mythology around doing the opposite of what they asked. So there, Marsyas found the flute on the ground, and that's the part nobody dwells on. He found it. Athena made it and threw it away because it distorted her face to play it, which is its own small story. The goddess of wisdom discarding a creation over vanity, or maybe not vanity, maybe something more specific than vanity, some refusal to be seen as ridiculous. But Marsyas found what she discarded, and he learned it, and he played it beautifully, and the beauty was real. It is not a story where the mortal was deluded. The mortal could actually play. The mortal played so well that he started saying what was true, that he played as well as a god. Apollo heard this, and the contest happened, and the muses judged, and Apollo won. Though I've always found it difficult to describe what Apollo winning actually means. In a contest where Apollo is also the god whose domain the contest concerns, which is circular in a way the myths never acknowledge, and the terms were whatever the winner wanted. Apollo wanted was Marsyas tied to a tree and his skin removed while he was still inside it. He was still alive. That's the detail. Not killed. Skinned. This is the god of reason. God who said, "Know yourself." The god whose temple at Delphi was the center of the civilized world's understanding of wisdom. He had a satyr flayed for being right about his own talent. Know why I keep coming back to the flute specifically. The fact that it was Athena's instrument, fact that the whole catastrophe begins with something discarded by one god and found by a mortal who made something of it. A line of consequence there. I can't quite. It keeps sliding away when I try to hold it. I've left it in anyway. Daphne. Running. All she's doing. It's the whole story. Compressed to its actual spine. A girl running from something that would not stop. She had asked her father to let her remain unmarried. It was not ambiguous. She had made her wishes known with the clarity that the myths usually reserve for divine commands, and it counted for nothing against Apollo's wanting. He was faster, would have caught her. The earth opened, or her father intervened, or something in the world took pity, depending on which version you're reading, and she became the laurel tree. The bay tree chose bark and roots and the ending of movement over what was coming for her. He put her leaves on his head. He decorates his temples with her, calls this love, or devotion, or grief. The myths are inconsistent about which, and I think the inconsistency is the point. Transformation that she chose over him became the symbol of his victories. She is everywhere. He is honored. He made her into his. Your hands. Let them be heavy. Let them rest where they are. The weight is real, and the dark is where you are supposed to be right now. Athena was born from a splitting. Zeus had swallowed Metis, swallowed her whole, an entire Titanus, the embodiment of wisdom, because an oracle said the child she was carrying would surpass him. And so he did what power does when prophecy about its own ending, which is not accept it, but try to eat it, and afterward developed a headache that grew until it became unbearable, and Hephaestus opened his skull with an axe. From the opening, Athena, full armor, war cry that shook the world's foundations. Born into the world already prepared for it, she is not simple. I want to say that carefully, because the myths invite a kind of easy sorting. The measured Olympians, the excessive ones, the ones whose appetites are their whole character, and Athena resists the taunting. She is consistently on the side of the ledger that looks, from our angle, like the right side. She helps Heracles. She guides Odysseus, which is no small thing. Odysseus being the particular kind of problem that requires a particular kind of patience. She gives Athens its olive tree, establishes the Areopagus, the court that breaks the cycle of blood answering blood, that chooses mercy in the case of Orestes when vengeance had been the only available logic for 3 generations. She is strategic in a way that looks, most of the time, like wisdom. And then there is what she did to Medusa, version that gets told quickly, that gets told on the way to the hero story. Medusa was a monster, snakes for hair, gaze that petrified. Perseus killed her. End. Version underneath. Medusa was a woman, mortal, priestess, dedicated to Athena's temple, which means under the protection of the goddess she served, which means the temple was supposed to be the safest place she could be. Poseidon, her uncle, the sea god, immeasurably more powerful than any mortal woman, violated her there. In the sanctuary, on the sacred ground, Athena punished Medusa, not Poseidon. Math of that decision has something in it I find genuinely hard to look at directly, something that feels like recognition, which is an uncomfortable thing to feel while describing a myth. Athena may have calculated that a war with Poseidon was a war she could not win. That is possible. That is even plausible. The myth does not give us Athena's interiority at this moment. It gives us only what she did, which is that she looked at the woman who had been violated in her own sacred space and gave her the hair of serpents and the face that turns flesh to stone. She made the one who had suffered into the thing others suffer from. She made her into the danger. I need to pause here. Sequence that follows. Perseus, the mirror shield, the sleeping Medusa, the decapitation. I've been circling it, and I want to collect the thread before I pull it. Perseus is a hero. Perseus is the grandson of Zeus, which means the grandson of the god, whose nature set all of this in motion, somewhere in the long chain of consequence that the myths call fate. And I sometimes think just the word for what happens when certain kinds of power go unchecked long enough. He was given a task he could not refuse, given tools, the mirrored shield, so the petrifying gaze would not find him, so he could approach what could not be approached directly, which is a kind of lesson embedded in the mechanics of a myth if you want to find one. He found Medusa sleeping. He took her head from the severed neck, Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, the warrior with the golden sword, children, been inside her from Poseidon the whole time, been growing in her while she was being hunted, while she was being what Athena had made her, and the severing released them into the world. The children she never got to. No, children who were inside her and came out at the end. Athena took the head and put it on her aegis, her divine shield. She carries Medusa's face into every battle, every judgment, every intervention in human affairs for the rest of eternity. It stops armies. It paralyzes enemies. The most powerful weapon of the goddess of wisdom and justice. A woman's face, made into a weapon, worn by the goddess who made it monstrous. The myths do not comment on this, never comment on this. The image just sits there in every depiction of Athena you have ever seen. That face on the shield or on the breastplate, looking out, and the visual language of Greek art treats it as an attribute or symbol of power. the same way Apollo carries his lyre, or Poseidon carries his trident, an attribute, a symbol of what the god has dominion over. I'm not going to tell you what to do with that. Anyway, Ares, god of war, is the most hated of the Olympians. And this is not a modern reading. This is what the myths say directly. Zeus tells him in the Iliad, plainly, that he is the most hateful of all the gods in that pantheon. In the company of a king who takes, without asking, a sea god who sank Odysseus' ships and drowned his crew over a blinded cyclops, a sun god who skins musicians. In that company, Ares is the most hated reason. I think this is the part I'm less certain about. The part where my interpretation might be showing more than the myth itself is that the other gods have learned to dress their violence in something. Zeus's violence is legitimized by law and prophecy, and the beautiful forms power takes when it has been worshipped long enough to become story. Poseidon's destruction is sublime, oceanic, ancient. Apollo's precision makes his cruelty look like surgery. But Ares just brings the war, cruel war, the part without the epic frame, the entrails in the mud, the disease moving through the camps, the grief that is not Achilles weeping beautifully over Patroclus, but a common soldier's wife waiting in a city that will never hear from him again. Ares is the part the other gods contain, but prefer not to look at. He is what remains when you strip away the aestheticization, and he loves Aphrodite. Maud, this is the part of Ares' story that gets told as comedy and is. I find this hard to articulate. I've tried a few times and kept cutting it. Something that resists comedy the more you hold it, loves her completely, with the total exposure that the myths deny to almost everyone, mortal or divine. The god of war, and he is open. He is vulnerable in the way the myths usually punish. Festus, who was thrown from Olympus, either by Hera, who found him ugly, or by Zeus, who found him inconvenient. The source is split, and either version is its own indictment. It's Festus who limps, the craftsman, who made the net invisible and stronger than chain and spread it over the bed, and called the gods into witness, and the gods came and laughed at Ares, god of war, caught, displayed. Aphrodite looked back at them. That detail is in Ovid, I think, or somewhere near him. The way she simply meets the spectacle with her own eyes and does not flinch. She has never been enchained of desire. She has no mechanism for it. She was born from the sea foam, born from the severed and discarded. Uranus' blood on water, and she rose from it, already the embodiment, a force that is older than the Olympians, older than the Titans, that Hesiod places alongside the most fundamental things: Gaia, Eros, Tartarus, night, and then Aphrodite, risen from a wound. She is the necessity of desire, beautiful things, but the thing that makes you unable to stop looking at them, the thing that makes gods forget their plans and mortals. This is not forget their oaths. This decoration, this is a force. She uses it without remorse and without apology. And I think that is what makes her genuinely difficult to think about for very long. Psyche was so beautiful that people brought offerings to her. it instead of to Aphrodite, left flowers at her feet, looked at her the way the myths say you should look at goddesses, Aphrodite and Aphrodite, who was not designed for displacement, who is the origin of every wanting in every heart, and therefore cannot be the thing that is set aside without something in the world coming loose. Aphrodite sent her son Eros to shoot the girl with an arrow, to make her fall in love with the worst possible option, desire as punishment, which is, when you think about it, the thing desire always risks becoming. Eros saw Psyche and pricked himself with his own arrow, saddened or. The myths are unclear, and I think deliberately so, because the question of whether love is ever but truly accidental is the kind of question the myths prefer to leave open. Followed. Psyche had to complete impossible tasks. She had to descend into the underworld and return. She had to face the sustained hostility of the goddess, who is the source of every feeling that makes the love story possible, and is also simultaneously trying to end it. Aphrodite, who gives love and weaponizes it in the same gesture, who wants every desire in every heart to pass through her, to be the medium, to be the spring. A spring can't be possessed. The myth knows this. The thirst that makes you seek it keeps returning, regardless of whether the spring has given anything back. Aphrodite, risen from severance, from what was thrown away, holding dominion over the thing that makes every other story possible and every other story painful. This is a kind of loneliness without a name for it. The words are coming slower now. Let them. Slower now. Let the sentences stretch. Let the commas do their work. Breathe where the pauses are, and don't rush past them because the story isn't going anywhere. It will still be here when you find the next word, when the next word finds you. Hephaestus, god who was thrown. One version, Hera looks at what she made and finds it wrong. Born lame, born imperfect, born into a place that requires perfection, the way the upper atmosphere requires thin air. You either have what it takes to exist there or you don't. And what Hephaestus had or didn't have was decided by a body he had no say in. She threw him from Olympus, her own child. Threw him because he did not meet the requirements of the elevation. Other version. Zeus in a rage, Hephaestus stepping between his father and his mother, the boy doing the thing a boy does when he cannot bear to watch, and Zeus taking him by the foot and throwing him from the mountain's edge. He fell for a day and a night. Some sources say 9 days. Fell all the way down to Lemnos, where the craftsmen lived, where people who worked with their hands found him and recognized something and took him in. 2 versions, 1 fall. I don't know that it matters which parent did it, and I mean that less as a dramatic statement than as something I've been sitting with while writing this, because the myths split on it and I kept turning to the split and couldn't resolve it, so I left both standing. What both versions agree on is simpler and worse than any interpretation. He was thrown by family for something in the body he had been given before he had any say in the matter. He became the greatest craftsman in the cosmos. He made the armor of Achilles, and the description of it takes up an entire book of the Iliad. shield alone, layer by layer, every scene on it, cities at war and cities at peace, the harvest, the vintage, the stars, the ocean running around the rim, the entire world rendered in divine metalwork. Because when Hephaestus makes a thing, he makes it completely. He made the golden automata, mechanical women, moving, thinking, assisting him in the workshop. And I find this detail almost impossible to walk past without stopping. The god of the forge building, official workers, 2,500 years before we had language for what they were, which is a thought I am going to leave exactly where it is and not follow. He made Pandora, made the chains that held Prometheus to the rock while the eagle came each morning. He made the net that caught Ares and Aphrodite. The things he makes bind and hold and confine. Bond, that is the pattern. Craftsman who was thrown makes the instruments of being trapped. And this is not coincidence. In a universe that runs on metaphor, where nothing in the character of a god is accidental, where what deity does expresses what a deity is at the level of mythologic. He knows what it is to be held by something you cannot break, to be looked at and found insufficient, spend eternity in the fire because the fire is warm, and the alternative is the cold of the place above that expelled you, the most useful of all the Olympians. Without him the order does not function. Without his work, the gods have no tools, no armor, no instruments of divine will. And he is also the one they laughed at. He is the one whose wife was the goddess of desire, and whose marriage was the thing the gods told as a joke, the one on whom two separate stories of being discarded have accumulated like, I want to say like silt in an old river. And I almost believe that metaphor, though it's not quite sealed. Wait, anyway, it accumulates. Victory, after the Titanomachy, sat in Zeus's hands like something that had already begun to cool. 10 years of war, Titans sealed in Tartarus behind bronze gates. The world won. Zeus sat on the throne of everything and heard the silence that surrounds absolute power. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of resolution, but the silence of those who have calculated appearance of agreement is safer than its absence. No one argues openly with the king of the gods, not sustainably. The silence is not harmony. Silence is the sound of suppression doing its work, and Zeus calls it order, and order is what it is. And the distinction between order through harmony and order through fear is the kind of distinction power tends to stop making once it no longer has to. What is gained stands in the shadow of what the gaining cost. Titan, who freed his siblings from Uranus, lost the future his father feared, which arrived anyway, which always arrives. King, who swallowed his children, spent years carrying them, 5 divine fires burning inside him while he called it safety. God, who threw his son away, made his son the most necessary being in the cosmos and gave him the interiority to build nets. Goddess of marriage is married to her betrayal, daily, endlessly, without relief. God of the sun wears a woman's face into battle, the face of the woman whose story he rewrote, which is a detail I keep returning to and cannot get comfortable with, and I don't think I'm supposed to. These gods are not a simple morality. They are something harder to dismiss than that, or a world that understood early that the divine and the damaged are not opposites, that to hold enormous power is to have the capacity for enormous harm, and the capacity does not politely present itself. That family is where the deepest wounds are delivered, because only those close enough to love you are close enough to reach the parts that break. Order and violence have been partners since the beginning, since the sickles that first separated sky from earth, since the first act of making required an act of cutting. I need to pause here. What comes next is the question that stopped me when I was writing this, stopped me for longer than I expected, and I want to approach it carefully. Did Cronus know? He knew about the prophecy established. It's why he swallowed. But did he know what it meant? The knowing that comes from below the mind. He understand in those years of his children inside him that what he carried was not absence but presence. Did he feel them? 5 divine beings burning inside a single body. He feel Demeter, the way soil feels grain, pressing towards something. Did Hestia, the hearth goddess, the flame, did she burn inside him? Or was he only a container, a mechanism of fear wearing a crown? Nobody asked. The myths didn't ask. The myths needed Cronus, clear and legible. The devouring father, the tyrant, the force that must be broken for the world to move into its next shape. And the clearest way to need someone is to flatten them, to make them only their function, to make the thing they did the whole of what they are, so that overthrowing them feels clean and finished. The myths needed the 10-year war. What? The young gods rising from the old body into the light of a new order did not have room for. And this is the part I kept cutting from drafts and kept putting back, because it felt presumptuous and also because it kept being true. The possibility that following your children, which is an objectively catastrophic act, might also have created an intimacy so total, a knowledge so complete and so dark, that the children who emerged from Cronus carried something of him that they could never name or locate or expel, that the gods of Olympus were made of their father, that Zeus's hunger is Cronus's hunger, a different shape. Hera's endurance is reassurance, refined by the specific education of watching and waiting and absorbing the patience of someone who had no other option. Hades is willingness to go down and stay down, to govern what nobody else will govern, to be the necessary and the unvisited. That this might be the inheritance of having spent the earliest years, divine existence in the absolute dark of a being who was afraid of you and swallowed you for it. Anyway, what do we carry from the ones who held us, even when the holding was wrong? What do we do when the answer doesn't come? Let it sit somewhere between your sternum and your spine, where the day's weight usually settles. Let the question take that space instead. Is lighter than you expect, or heavier? It depends entirely on what you already carry there. The sentences are shorter now. The pauses stretch. Demeter, she is the grain, the harvest, principle of the earth, giving what living things require. Her name reaches back into language old enough that the scholars still argue about what it means. Earth Mother, Grain Mother, the prefix D pointing somewhere before the alphabet was fixed, and whatever the etymology resolves to, what she is functionally is the reason human civilization was possible at all. Grain, storage, the cycle of planting and return, the knowledge that winter ends. Or she lost her daughter. Persephone went into the ground, taken or drawn or called. The ambiguity the myths preserve deliberately. The way they preserve all ambiguities that live at the edge of what can be decided. Demeter did not know where she was. The not knowing. That's the detail the myths return to. Press on, will not leave alone. She wandered in the shape of an old woman. She asked at every door, Wadi. She lit torches from Hecate's volcanic fires and searched in the dark for a girl who was somewhere underneath the searching. Went to Helios, the sun who sees everything, and asked him what he had seen. The not knowing was the wound beneath the wound, which is almost always where the real wound is. She stopped the world. She folded her hands and the grain stopped. The seeds sat in the earth and did nothing. The animals looked up from the dry fields with the confused suffering of creatures that have always trusted the reliable and cannot process its absence. Mortals began to die, not dramatically, not in the epic register, just this slow arithmetic of starvation, the body using what it has until it has nothing. Sacrifices went unperformed because sacrifice requires abundance, and abundance had closed its fist. Gods on Olympus noticed the quiet where devotion had been, the diminishment of offerings, the specific absence of worship, which fills a divine existence the way breath fills a body. Zeus bargained, but here is the dark thread running through the mother's grief, and I've been trying to find the right way to hold it without simplifying it, without making it tidier than it is. The world nearly did. The people, the worshippers, the ones who kept the divine economy turning by their devotion and their offerings and their need, they nearly starved because Demeter's grief was larger than the world's survival, because the love of a mother for a lost child, concentrated and deprived and maddened by uncertainty, compressed into the form of refusal, of the body that will not give what it was made to give, also destruction. The goddess of nourishment nearly destroyed everything through grief. The darkness is doing its work now. Let it. She got her daughter back, half of her, or the half that belongs to spring, to the ground opening, to the seeds finally doing what seeds are supposed to do. The other half, the half where Persephone goes back down, back to the husband, back to the other throne. That half is winter. Every year, the same grief, scheduled, arriving on the same calendar. Demeter knows it's coming, and it comes anyway. This is what the myth is doing with the most ordinary experience there is. Love and loss are not opposites, not enemies arranged on either side of something, but the same motion, that the harvest exists because of the winter, that the warmth of what returns is warm specifically because of the waiting. Demeter opens her hands in spring, and the world accepts what she gives, and we call it nature. And we walk across the green earth without looking down, without considering what is underneath us, without remembering that the ground is also a kingdom, that someone down there is on a throne that is also, in some version of the story, also home. She waits every year, waiting right now, depending on where the calendar sits. And Hermes, born in the morning, by evening, he had invented the lyre, stolen Apollo's cattle, hidden the cattle, fashioned an instrument from a tortoise shell, and when Apollo came furious and certain of the theft, Hermes looked up at him with the face of a newborn and absolute innocence, and lied directly into the god of truth's eyes, and then bargained his way out of punishment with the lyre itself. This all happened on day one. Who he was from the first hours, someone who understood at a cellular level that any door can open if you find the right angle, that the rule and the gap in the rule are equally real, and gap is more interesting. He is the messenger, the guide, one who crosses every boundary the cosmos has established between the living and the dead, between Olympus and the earth below, between one side of an argument and another side that needs something smoothed over before it can be delivered. The psychopomp, the soul guide, the last face the newly dead see before the world they knew recedes completely, takes them by the hand the myths suggest, with warmth, particular gentleness of someone who has made this journey many times and knows which turnings are unkind and which words help and which silence is better than words. Also an unapologetic liar and a thief and the god of commerce and of communication and of borders. Then these domains don't scatter when you look at them. They cohere around a single principle, which is the ability to move between what is established and what is possible, between the world as it presents itself and the world as it could be rearranged with the right words at the right moment, with the right sleight of hand applied, while someone's looking somewhere else. He survives everything. Titanomachy, the gigantomachy, the long grinding machinery of divine politics and divine war, survives because he is never entirely on any side, because the messenger serves the message, and the message is always changing, because the trickster's most durable trick is the appearance of loyalty, while holding open, always, somewhere in the back of the mind where the cleverness lives, the possibility of a different door. Worry. This is also, and I find this hard to articulate without it sounding smaller than I mean it. This is a loneliness with no obvious name, one who crosses all boundaries, builds no permanent home in any of them. He moves between the living and the dead, between gods and mortals, between the truth and the serviceable version of the truth. And somewhere in all that crossing, in all those thresholds, there is a question he perhaps never pauses long enough to actually ask. Where is mine, Hermes, twin to Apollo, born first? And this matters in the mythological logic because it means her first act was her own birth, already functional, already helping, already the protector of women in childbirth before she finished being born herself. Delos, the floating island, which Poseidon pinned in place with his trident specifically for this delivery. The geography reorganized itself for these two children. B is the hunter, the moon, the wilderness before the road goes through it, the mountain before the temple, the goddess of the wild places the city has not yet claimed, and she runs through them with her companions and answers to no authority outside herself. And I want to be careful here about the word that gets attached to her, the virgin goddess, because the Greek underneath that word is not what the centuries made it mean. Autonomia, self-sovereignty, one who belongs to no domestic structure, no man, no arrangement of household and obligation. That is what the word is holding, not absence of desire so much as the refusal to be organized around someone else's. She kills without hesitation. Theon stumbled on her bathing. Stumbled, the myths say. Accidentally, a hunter who was in the wrong place, and Artemis turned him into a stag, and his own dogs tore him apart. And she watched, and she did not call them off. Whether he intended to see what he saw is perhaps beside the point in mythological logic. The boundary was crossed. Consequences are calibrated to the crossing, not to the intention behind it. There is something there that almost feels like I'm going to pull back from the word I almost used. The myth just states it. She watched. She let the dogs finish. I need to pause here. Orion is next, and it's the part of Artemis's story I find most. It resists the clean treatment, is what I mean. Let me collect the thread. Orion, the great hunter. In some versions, her companion, her equal, the only being who matched her in the territory that was entirely hers. The myths disagree, as they disagree about most things that touch on feeling, whether they loved each other, what exactly they were to each other in those nights running through the wilderness together. But in the version that persists, it is Apollo who arranges the death, tricks his sister into shooting the distant shape moving across the water, frames it as a challenge, a game, a test of her famous, and Artemis's arrow is perfect, because her arrows are always perfect. The shape on the water was Orion. She placed him in the sky. She took. This is the part I kept circling while writing this, the part that wouldn't let me move on. She took the only being who had ever been her equal in the place that was most completely hers. You put him in the stars, where he hunts across the winter sky forever, steady, where anyone on earth can find him on any cold, clear night. The 3 stars of the belt, the sword hanging below, Betelgeuse burning at his shoulder, hunting across the dark above us without end. That grief, commemoration, the only form of keeping available to someone who cannot keep things the ordinary way. I don't know. Thought about it more than seems proportionate, and I still don't know. The stars are old grief. Sometimes. That is sometimes exactly what they are. Not only the mechanics of nuclear fusion at distances that make the word distance meaningless. Sometimes, at the right hour, when the dark is real and the silence has settled, they are what the people who named them needed them to be. A place to put what the earth could not hold. A permanence for the unbearable. The weight beneath whatever covers you is real. Let it stay there, on the outside. You don't have to carry it. Let the inside of you go somewhere else, one more. Anyway, Dionysus, he doesn't fit the first and most essential thing about him. He does not fit on the mountain, does not fit the category, does not arrive with the clean portfolio of domain and attribute that the other Olympians carry, the last of them. The one who had to earn the seat, the one who is also of the earth, also of the body, also of the outside the walls, also of the territory where Artemis runs, but in a completely different register. The not the hunt, but the vine, the theater, the mask, the myth, the dissolution of the individual self into something collective that the individual self cannot contain and cannot entirely survive. He is twice born, and I want to be precise about this because the precision matters. His mother was Semele, mortal woman, daughter of Cadmus of Thebes, lover of Zeus, who asked the question no mortal should ask. Show me what you actually are, not the form you take for me, the real thing, the divine itself. Zeus could not refuse her because she had asked under the oath of the Styx, the unbreakable one, the oath that binds even gods. And so he appeared to her as he actually was, the thunderbolt in one hand, the divine fire undiluted and unfiltered and not adjusted for what mortal bodies can withstand. The fire of what a god is, actually, when not rendered in mortal compatible form, killed her. She burned. The child survived. Bocchais. Zeus took the infant from the burning, from the body of the woman the truth killed. And he sewed the child into his own thigh, carried him to term in his own body, gave birth through his leg, body. Dionysus's second birth. Once from the mortal woman, the divine burned through. Once from the body of the father who rescued what was left, mirrors the story of Cronus. The body as container, the children kept inside, the impossible emergence. But the logic runs the other direction. Cronus swallowed out of fear, Zeus carried out of something closer to grief or responsibility, or both at once. The myths not being particularly interested in separating those two things. Twice born, from burning, and from the body of a god. He arrives into the world already defined by transformation, already marked by the experience of surviving what should not be survivable. He does not fit, will never entirely fit. The sentences are shorter now. The dark is thicker. The words come like water finding its level through stone. Let them. Hera persecutes him. Of course she does. Is Zeus's child by another woman. And Hera's logic in these situations is consistent, has always been consistent, which is itself a kind of dark integrity. You could argue, though I'm not sure you should, drives Dionysus to madness, or it drives the people surrounding him to madness. And the myths blur this line in a way that feels deliberate, the way the myths blur lines when the blurring is the point. Dionysus and madness are not cause and effect arranged in a clean sequence. They are the same country, entered through the same door. He wanders, goes east, past the Aegean, past the organized world into India, which is where the Greeks put whatever needed to be very far away. And he teaches the vine, the grape, fermentation that turns fruit into something that lowers the particular, carefully maintained interior walls that keep a self a self. He teaches the theater, the mask, practice of inhabiting a face that is not yours, so you can learn what lives behind a face that is not yours, which is, I keep wanting to call this something, to put a name on what that practice really is, and the name I keep reaching for is too recent and too clinical, and I'm going to leave the gap there instead. The wearing of faces, oldest technology for understanding another person from the inside. He descends to the underworld, goes down to retrieve his mother. Semele, the woman the divine fire burned through, who has been in the kingdom of the dead since the night the truth of Zeus killed her. And he brings her back, renames her Thyone, the one moved by divine ecstasy, and he takes her to Olympus. The twice-born god retrieves the mother his birth burned. He closes the circle that his origin broke open. Part I could write for much longer than I'm going to. Something in the structure of it, the god of dissolution descending to retrieve the person his own existence destroyed, that I find I can't quite get to the bottom of. Left it here with less than it deserves, and I know that. The Maenads, Huayni, the women who followed Dionysus into the mountains in the fullness of the god's possession, in the state the Greeks called enthusiasmos, the god entering the body. These women ran through the wild places at night, in a state that the word madness only approximates, the self losing its edges, boundary between the individual and something larger, becoming permeable, becoming thin, becoming finally a boundary in name only. In this state, they tore things apart. Pentheus was the king of Thebes, tried to suppress the worship of Dionysus, had decided which states of consciousness were legitimate, which expressions of the divine would be permitted inside the city walls, which doors were not allowed to open. Went to the mountain to spy on the women's rites, disguised at the god's own suggestion, placed in the branches of a tree to watch what he believed he could watch from a safe distance. When the god let the ecstasy lift for a moment, let the Maenads see the shape in the tree. What they saw was a lion, a mountain lion, something to be torn. Mother Agave led the tearing, and she carried its head down from the mountain with the specific pride of a hunter who has done what hunters do, who has caught what she was chasing. And she showed to her father Cadmus and said, "Look what I took in the mountains." And Cadmus saw what it was. The madness lifted. But pause here, because the thing Euripides does with this story, what the Bacchae does, that makes it the most uncomfortable play in the ancient repertoire, is that it refuses to make the god wrong. Pentheus was suppressing genuine religious experience. Wes was the one making the decisions about which forms of the overwhelming were permissible, and the god of the threshold, the god who exists to dissolve the boundaries, the orderly mind, tructs, against what cannot be categorized. When that god is suppressed, he returns wearing the face of what was suppressed. Violence of the Maenads is the violence of everything the city walls locked out, arriving back to sea. Pentheus feared came back as the specific thing he had feared most, and his mother's hands were the instrument of it, and the play just holds that. Doesn't resolve it. Holds it open. God was never safe. This is what the Dionysus myths are saying, collectively, underneath all the wine and theatre and ivy, that the forces you refuse to acknowledge accumulate. They find the gap, return, wearing a different face, or no face, or the enormous, ungovernable shape of a need that was refused long enough that it has outgrown the name it started with. You cannot lock the god out. The wall you built to keep the thing out is the thing that guarantees its return. So there. And so we come back, back to where the whole night began, which was the paradox. The dark side of the Olympians is the content of the divine, not a departure from it. Gods of Greece were powerful beings whose power was inseparable from their damage, whose love was entangled with their violence, whose order required constant violence to maintain, whose beauty almost always born from something terrible. If you followed the story back far enough, ancient Greeks understood and encoded in these stories something the waking world keeps trying to forget, that the sacred and the dangerous are the same territory. The god who heals and the god who destroys carry the same name. The mountain at the center of the world is also the mountain where the most powerful beings in the cosmos sit on their thrones and need and fear and grieve and hunger. The same verbs that apply to the smallest mortal in the outermost village on the farthest edge of the world they built. They built the temples because they understood this, because the gods were good, but because the gods were real. Real in the sense that they were names given to forces that were already real. Forces that moved through human experience, whether or not anyone named them, or built a thing in their honor. The hunger that continues past the point it should stop. The grief that compresses the world down to a single absence and withholds everything. Anger that outlasts the thing that caused it. Its way of fire outlasts its fuel. Burning on the structure of the room itself. The love that demands the beloved be different from what they are. Power that reaches, reflexively, for what it has no right to take. The craftsman who builds nets because he knows what confinement is. The arrow that always finds what it was aimed at. Anyway, or descriptions. The word myth is almost a misdirection. It implies something that was believed and is no longer something that has been surpassed, something safely historical. But the hunger hasn't stopped. The grief still closes the world down. The power still reaches. The trickster still holds every door slightly open. The arrow still lands, but here. And I want to sit with this question rather than rush past it. If the Olympians were watching, if Zeus still occupies the conceptual space where sky meets the idea of power, Aphrodite still moved in the current that runs through every room where two people look at each other past the point of looking away. Hermes still works the margins between what is said and what is meant. Would they recognize themselves in what we found tonight? Would they recognize the darkness, wonder? Or would they look at what we've uncovered, what we've followed all the way down to the roots, and feel the thing that every being feels when someone looks too closely, when the distance required for worship collapses into the proximity that allows for actual knowledge? Would they feel seen? And is being seen for a god the same experience it is for a person? The recognition, after all this time, comfort or threat? Don't answer. The darkness is asking. Darkness is doing what it does in the hours when the daylight is far enough away. It opens the questions the light keeps closed. Let them open, them be there, expanding in the space between your last thought and the first edge of sleep. Large questions, also somehow personal, questions that touch the place where you keep the thing you've been carrying, the thing from today, from this week, from the particular arrangement of circumstances that brought you to this specific night. Let the question be the last thing, not the answer. The weight is where you left it, beneath whatever covers you. Fire in these old stories, the one that burned inside the myths long enough to survive temples, libraries, wars, translations, and the slow erosion of belief across 2,500 years, be the only thing you hold. And even that you can set down. Even that the darkness can hold. We began with chaos, the oldest dark, before the Olympians had thrones, before Cronus swallowed and Zeus threw, and Hephaestus built, and Demeter closed her hands, before any of the names were fixed to any of the steady forces. Every night you enter something like that state, the body going back toward the older thing, before the separations, before the 12 thrones and the 12 hungers, before the stories had they have. The darkness is older than the gods. It was there before anyone named it. Every night, briefly, you go back before. That is enough. That has always been enough. These stories carried you somewhere tonight. If the old mountain gave you something to hold or something to set down, the next night opens onto another dark, another truth waiting at the border. Sleep and story share a wall. All you have to do is return. Let the weight stay. Let this hold what you cannot. Good night.